It is working. Okay, there are 19 days left till your last class. 19 days, 1-9. You know what that means, right? I don't even have to nag you. It's all coming down. Hell and brimstone and everything. 5 p.m. on Monday, 19 days from now, is when your project is due. So if you haven't started on it, please do. If you're already working on it, keep working. If you're already done, even better. Okay? So just a reminder, so in case you're putting things off, there are not that many weeks left. There are. Thank you. Thanks. So that's one. Second is your third quiz is upstairs to be picked up. You haven't picked it up yet. So the way this works then is your best two quizzes, if you took all three, will end up being counted as is, and your third quiz is going to get marked up. And I think a few of you might misunderstand how it's going to get marked up. Somebody tell me what's going to happen to your third quiz? What's the rule that I can? I'm just curious about these rules that are floating around people's minds. People describe to me what they think the rule is, and really, that's what you thought it was? Okay. So what's the rule on the third quiz? It'll get marked up to average of the first two quizzes and the final exam. So if you got to, I know a few of you took 2 10s. I noticed you just took the third quiz off. I could tell, right? I mean, it showed up and again. It's not going to cost you very much, but the reason I've instituted that rule is otherwise when you get 2 10s in the first two quizzes, there's really no incentive to show up for the third quiz. This way there is still some incentive, because if you crash and burn in the final, which I'm not suggesting you should, right, it could still cost you on the third quiz, but that's water under the bridge. So don't crash and burn. If you blew off the third quiz and you had 2 10s, my guess is you'll get back to a 29-30 on the final. So I'm not worried about you. But it's the reason the rule is the way it is otherwise people then at some point will strategically miss quizzes. So if you miss the third quiz, not the end of the world again, because you're going to get the 2 10s and then you got the 40% final. So either way, the final really, really matters. And it's a comprehensive final. It'll cover everything in the class, all 3 packets, 800 slides. But I don't think you should go slide 1 through slide 800, because if you get the last 200 slides, you basically got the first 600 as well. So today I want to kind of talk a little bit about real options. Remember, I introduced the notion of option pricing, and I want to use the start of the class test today to kind of bring some of the issues in real options to the fore. So let's play a game. Let's assume that you have developed this neat new technology. And here's what the technology allows you to do. It speeds up download speeds on your phone and allows you to download large files in no time at all. That'll be good, right? It's a great technology, but right now it will cost you $2 billion to implement this technology. And based on what you know about the market today, your expected cash flows from developing the technology are going to be only $1.5 billion. Let me pause right there. You're going to cost $2 billion to develop the technology, $1.5 billion in cash flows. Let's start with the easy one. Would you develop the technology today? No, it's negative net present value, right? Now let's switch roles. Let's suppose you now work for Apple or Samsung. You see this technology. It's a non-viable technology today. Let's suppose it will cost Apple the same $2 billion to develop the technology. It's still the $1.5. So it's still a negative net present value investment to them. Would you be willing to pay for the rights to this non-viable technology? Why? Seems to break every rule in corporate finance, right? Negative net present value, bad project. Why would you pay?
Because in the future you have
Because you get the right for a period of time and things could change. Like what? Well, that's kind of a defensive way of doing this, right? Because then you can build the cash flows. That's in a sense a cop-out, because you're saying I'm getting cash flows by stopping other people. I'm not letting you do that. It's a negative net present value.
But I'm just curious, when we say like the cash flow is 1.5 billion, right? Could we say that if Apple buys this technology,
I'm not going to let you give that escape hatch. So basically assume that even if Apple buys the technology, it's non-viable today, right? Because otherwise you can just make it a positive net present value. You can bring in synergy. You can let's assume that this is just it's just not viable today. It's just too expensive. You might still buy the rights to it. Why? Because things can change, right? Your production technology might change. The too expensive might become cheaper. The market for big downloads might expand, right? People might be watching Game of Thrones every minute of every day over and over again on their phones, and they need. You see what I'm talking about? You have a non-viable technology. You might still be willing to pay for the rights to that technology because things can change. Let's build on that. Let's suppose you think about bidding on this technology. Would how much you bid be affected by how long you have the rights for? Let's start easy. As I increase the length of the period, you're going to pay more, right? If I give you 10 years rather than 5. But here's the interesting twist. What if I told you that the technology is very uncertain, that the way the technology will evolve, nobody really knows? What does that do to the value of the right? Does it increase the value of the right? It actually increases the value of the right? Why? Because it's an option. Now, the reason it sounds like an abstraction. When would I ever run into this? Why are people investing in Uber and Lyft? Because of how much money they make as ride-sharing companies today? No, they're losing tons of money because there is this possibility of autonomous cars, right? Huge potential market. Right now it's not viable. It's not viable for many different reasons. The cars aren't ready, the processes aren't ready. So if I try to do it today, it'll cost me tons of money. The net present value is negative. But you can see why people are paying. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future, and if you can get, that's the essence of the real options argument. You're not paying for what the cash flows are today. You're paying for the potential for those cash flows could change. One final question. Let's assume that this technology becomes viable 1 year in. You know what I mean, viable, right? The present value of the cash flows is now greater than the cost of developing the technology. Would you develop the technology right away? What's the trade-off you're looking at? It's now viable, so you want to develop it so you'll make money. But by developing, what do? You cut off the optionality, the possibility that you could learn more and come up with a better product, learn more about the market. This is something you constantly face with real options. Is once an option becomes viable, you might, for the same reason you don't exercise an option the minute it becomes in the money, right? You wait, there's time premium on the option. It actually creates some very interesting and some potentially troubling consequences. Because today we're going to talk about drug patents as options. So what does it mean when I say a drug becomes viable? The drug you've been waiting for, you have MS and you come up with a drug. The drug is now viable. What are you doing? You're waiting for the company to develop the drug, and it doesn't, and it doesn't. Economically, you can actually see why the company might delay doing it, because well, it does it, it collects information, it makes the drug better. But while it's doing it, you're waiting for the drug to come through. So this is real life consequences in terms of products not coming to market right away. So we're going to build on all of that. Let's go back to where we left off on options. So remember that pine tree? I flipped it around and I said you smooth out the outside, you get a normal distribution. That binomial distribution was built on two basic building blocks. All option pricing models are. The first is the notion of a replicating portfolio. What is a replicating portfolio? Somebody help me out. What is a replicating portfolio?
You can replicate a security using smoothing more.
In other words, you can replicate a very specific security, call option by borrowing money and buying the underlying stock, or a put option by selling short and investing that money in the underlying. So basically in either case you are using the underlying asset and borrowing or lending to create something which looks exactly like your option. In terms of what? In terms of cash flows. So all option pricing models are built on the notion of replicating portfolios and arbitrage. What does that mean? If I can create a replicating portfolio that has exactly the same cash flows as a call option, what does arbitrage require? That the two have to trade at the same price. That's what we did in the binomial model, right? We created replicating portfolios. We saw what it cost us to create these replicating portfolios. Then we made that leap of faith saying, if that's what it cost me to create the replicating portfolio, that's what the option should trade for. So in binomial models, it's right there in front of you, replication arbitrage. But as I said, binomial models are incredibly information intensive. Imagine trying to draw a binomial tree for a 3-month option with 1-minute windows or 1-second time periods. You're going to have this incredibly dense binomial tree. And we said, let's suppose you did it. And then we flipped it on its side and we said, what happens if I smooth out the outside of the tree? We said, it looks like a normal distribution. The limiting case for the binomial when price changes become small, as time periods become small, if price changes also become small, the limiting distribution for the binomial is the normal distribution. The Black-Scholes model is a limiting case of the binomial option pricing model. But it does require that price changes. You know what I mean by price changes become small? Is as I go from t equal to 1 day to 1 hour to 1 minute to 1 second, the price changes go from $5 to 3 to 1. So when I make it 1 second, the price change can only be 1/10 of a cent. It's called a continuous price distribution. And all Black-Scholes models are built on that presumption that prices move continuously. But once you get there, your life becomes simpler because estimating the value of the option, you can use the Black-Scholes model for. So Fisher, Black, and Marin-Schultz in 1971 came up with this breakthrough. Because until 1971, the way people valued options is like they valued every other asset. They got the expected cash flows, they got a risk adjusted. Paul Samuelson built a warrant valuation model in the late 60s that looked very much like a stock valuation, cash flows, discount rates, present value. And what Fisher, Black, and Marin-Schultz said is, why are we even valuing options? Why don't we value the replicating portfolio? Because if we value the replicating portfolio, we've got the value of the option. And in the original Black-Scholes model, for which they got the Nobel Prize, there were 5 variables determining the value of an option. Now, I'm going to list the 5, but I want you to remember that last session I said there were 6 variables. One is missing, and I want you to tell me which one the original Black-Scholes was missing. So here are the 5 variables that determine the value of an option in the Black-Scholes model. S is the value of the underlying asset. So that's 1. K is the strike price. R is the riskless rate. T is the life of the option. And sigma. Don't ask me why Microsoft changes my sigmas to question marks, right? Remember to change betas to bicycles too? Microsoft is crazy. When it goes from Mac to PC, it takes some fonts and screws them up. So S, K, R, T, and sigma, 5 variables. There were 6. What's the missing variable? What seems to be, what is it? Well, that's on the other side. So that's what I get as output. But there were 6 variables that actually determined that value, but I have only 5 of the 6. If you want, you can look back and at the, look dividends. Remember we said when you pay dividends and you have a call option, the stock price drops? There were no dividends. You're saying, how come? The original Black-Scholes was designed to value options on stocks that did not pay a dividend or dividend protected options. You're saying, what the heck is a dividend protected option? if you have a strike price of 40 and there's a $2 dividend, the reason you normally worry is the stock price drops by roughly $2. With the dividend protected option, the strike price will also drop by $2. So how many options are there like that? None that I know of in the world, but the original Black-Scholes was designed to value options. And the reason was very simple. Fisher Black and Myron Scholes, when they were trying to develop the Black-Scholes model, got the original intuition right, replicating portfolio. They wrote the math down, they got the equation, then they got stuck because they came up with an equation that nobody in finance had ever seen before. And they gave up. And legend has it, at the University of Chicago at that time, that Fisher Black left his office door open one day with this unfinished paper and this equation that they could not solve on the table. And some unnamed physics PhD student at the University of Chicago wandered into Fisher Black's office. Don't ask me what he was trying to do, maybe steal a few things. Stopped and looked at that equation. And we do this in first year physics all the time. It's a stochastic calculus equation. We use Ito's lemma, and with Ito's, so he basically wrote out, and that was the breakthrough. So the Nobel Prize should actually have gone to Fisher Black, Myron Scholes, an unknown PhD student in physics. Stochastic calculus is something we'd never seen in finance till Fisher Black and Myron Scholes ran into an option pricing. But that's stochastic calculus. The math was so messy, they said, we're not even going to deal with dividends, we'll act like there are no dividends. Classic economist solution to a problem, which is assume there's no problem. That way, it's like you heard the old story about economists put in an island with no food and how they dealt with it, right? They said assume there's food and everything's going to be okay, right? So they assumed away the problem. We can't assume it away. So I'm going to give you a dividend adjusted version of Black-Scholes, but the original Black-Scholes was SK, RT, and sigma. And from those five, you get the Black-Scholes model. You've all seen the Black-Scholes model? It's a ritual of passage through business school that you at least, I didn't ask you whether you remembered the Black-Scholes model. I said, have you seen it? Right? And because the Black-Scholes model is a classic. It's a classic because it makes you touch all those virgin buttons on your calculator. The natural log, the exponential, the minus RT. So what's that for? Now you find out. So I'm going to go through the original Black-Scholes, and I'm going to tell you embedded in the Black-Scholes is the same binomial equation, the same replicating portfolio, but it's hidden. So here's what the Black-Scholes model gives you for the value of a call option. It says take the value of the stock S times N of D1. You're saying what the heck is N of D1? Well, I can tell you what D1 is. D1 is this messy equation. And in that equation you see SK, RT, and sigma. All five variables play in. You plug them in, you come up with the D1. You're saying, what does D1 mean? Intuitively, I couldn't give you an explanation. But if you take the D1, you go to a normal distribution. N of D1 is the area under a cumulative normal distribution. So let's say D1 is 0.40. So you plug the numbers in. 0.40, the cumulative area under the distribution is 0.66. Take a look at these numbers for N of D. They range from 0 to 1. They look a lot like a probability, right? And in fact, they're implicitly a probability. So I take the D1, I come up with N of D1. So S times N of D1, an area under the normal distribution. Incidentally, in statistics books, you see a normal distribution at the end of the book. That's the height of the distribution. So this is called a cumulative normal distribution, the area under the distribution. So S times N of D1. Then you take K E minus RT. What's K? It's a strike price, right? What's E minus RT do? It's just the present value of the strike price. Because the Black-Scholes model was designed to value what are called European options, a very unfortunate choice of term, because it has nothing to do with geography. What makes European options different from traditional options? You can exercise them only at expiration. So you can think whatever you want for the next 2 years, but for the next 2 years you're helpless. So you know what Black and Scholes are doing, right? So you don't have to pay the strike price till 2 years from now. They're taking the present value of the strike price. You're saying, I've never used E minus RT to do present value. Normally we take 1 plus R raised to power T. That's what you do in discrete time. This is the, so if you don't have an exponential button in your calculator, just take the present value button. It'll work pretty well to get you the present value of the strike price. And N of D2 is also an area under the normal distribution, but it has a very special meaning in option pricing models, which we'll come back and use. It gives you the risk-neutral probability that your option will be in the money. You know what I mean by in the money. S will be greater than K. So when I say N of D2 is 0.7, I'm saying there's a 70% chance that this option will get exercised. And embedded in the Black-Scholes is the replicating portfolio. Remember how in the binomial I solved for delta and B? It's in here. In fact, if I wanted to replicate this call, here's what I need to do. I need to buy N of D1 shares of stock. That's called the option delta. And borrow the present value of the strike price times N of D2. If I do that, I've created a replicating portfolio. So just like in the binomial, I solve for it. In the Black-Scholes, it's in there. So this option delta is what I need to buy to replicate the portfolio. Every time the stock price changes, that delta will change. Why do I care? Because if I'm hedging a portfolio, I need to know what happens to delta. If the standard deviation changes the delta, that's called the option vega. As the time to expiration changes, the delta changes. That's called the option theta. Every single Greek letter you run into in option pricing has something to do with this equation and how the option delta will change as S changes, as K changes, as T changes. You crack the code. There's nothing mysterious about option pricing. It's all built around the replicating portfolio. So that is the traditional Black-Scholes model. If you have dividends, there is a way you can bring them into the model. And you have to make an assumption. If you're willing to make the assumption that the dividend yield on the underlying asset will remain pretty stable over the life, I can adjust the model, and here's how I do it. If I have a call option, what's my replicating portfolio? I borrow money and I buy N of D1 shares of stock, right? When I don't have dividends, when I borrow money, I've got to pay an interest rate. In this case, the riskless rate. Why? Because I've created a riskless arbitrage. And I stop there. But if I receive dividends on the stock, what does it do? I pay 4% on an interest rate, and what does the dividend do? Well, first, it'll reduce my carrying cost, right? So if I pay a 4% interest rate and collect 2% in dividends, net, I have to pay only 2%. So the first thing you're going to notice is wherever I have an R, I have an R minus Y because I've subtracted the dividend yield because I receive it on the stock. The second is my stock price might be $80 today, but if there's a 2% dividend yield, knowing what happens on the ex-dividend day, that stock price will drop. So when I multiply S by E minus YT, I'm just reducing the value for the stock for the expected dividends over the life of the stock, of the option. So I do two adjustments. One is I replace the current stock price with this dividend yield adjusted current stock price, saying it's going to be lower because of the dividends. And second, I reduce my carrying cost. This is the Black-Scholes model with dividend yields built in. And if you can value a call option, you can always value a put option because puts and calls with the same strike price are bound together by what's called put-call parity, which is if you give me the call price, you give me the stock price, and you give me the borrowing rate, the put has to be determined because otherwise I can make pure profits from the two. So that put-call parity allows me to give you the value of a put option. But these are dividend yield adjusted versions of the Black-Scholes. And as I go through real options, you're going to see me use this equation a lot more than the conventional Black-Scholes. Because in real options, there is this something that looks like a dividend yield that I have to bring into the process to get a realistic estimate. Question? You had a question? No?
Oh yeah, so I was just going to confirm, what happens if we assume that the dividend yield might change?
If your dividend yield might change, I mean, your variance, in fact, all the inputs can change, right? The traditional Black-Scholes assume standard deviation remains the same, the dividend yield remains the same. To the extent that those numbers are non-stationary, the values you get will not be precise, right? They will change as well. So it just means there's more uncertainty in the option pricing model. Remember, option pricing model is really designed to value short-term options, 2 or 3 month options. And one of the penalties we face when we use these option pricing models to value 10-year options. On real assets, we're stretching these models often to breaking point. Yep.
Would the put option be the inverse price of the call option?
Well, it's got to be related. It's not necessarily the inverse because they're driven by different forces. But if you have call option with a 2-year expiration with a $40 strike price, the put option with the same expiration, the same strike price, has to be bound together by put-call parity. Right? They will be moving in opposite directions. So there's an asymmetry about them. But they will not move proportionately in opposite directions because they're affected by different bounds. Right? Now, the Black-Scholes, as I described is a model designed to value European options. And European options can be exercised only at expiration. We're going to use these option pricing models to value real options. And with real options, early exercise is a feature, not a bug. I want to exercise early, and let me explain why. I'm going to argue that a patent is like an option. What's the option? I can develop the patent into a commercial product. Let's say you have a 17-year patent. Do you want to wait till the 365th day of the 17th year to develop your patent? I don't. What do you lose if you do that? You lose the entire protection you get from the patent, right? So the essence of a patent is I want to develop early. Do you see where I'm going with this? If I use a Black-Scholes model to value a patent, the pushback you can have is, hey, this is a model designed to value European option. This option, by definition, is not a European option because you're exercising early. How come you're using the model? What I'm preparing for you for is real options is full of purists who think that they have the perfect way. So if you use the Black-Scholes, they'll pick on you and say, you should be using a Black-Scholes, you should be using a binomial model. Why? Because you can allow for early exercise and changing variance. And I concede all of that. If I lived in a perfect world where you supplied me with all the information I wanted, guess what? I would never use the Black-Scholes. I'd use binomial option pricing models to value every real option. But here's the cost of using the binomial. I need to draw those little branches. Then what do I need to do? I need to populate each branch with numbers. And it requires immense amounts of information. So often when people don't want you to use the Black-Scholes, they're not ready to use a binomial either, so you end up in this gray area of nobody does anything. You know what? I'm going to use the Black-Scholes. And I'm going to do it with open eyes. It's not the right model. But here's what it's going to give me. It's going to give me a lower bound value. Why a lower bound value? Because if I can value an option as a European option, the right to exercise early should actually make it worth more. And I'll value it on the presumption that real assets often jump around, and I value it using a continuous price process which undervalues the option. So if nothing else, it will give me a lower bound. And I'm willing to accept a lower bound that's imperfect than not come up with a value at all. So if anybody asks you, how come you're using the Black-Scholes to value a real option? Accept the fact that this is not the perfect model. There's early exercise and prices jump. But say, look, it'll give me a lower bound value. If you can make it into a binomial model that's more precise, I can go along. But it's just pragmatic choices that drive you towards a Black-Scholes model. One final point. Once you've learned real options, you're going to feel really superior to people who don't know this technology. Because you got this powerful technology in your hands. Use it selectively. Bringing out real option pricing at every drop of the hat is like bringing out a bazooka launcher to kill an ant you see on the wall. You will kill the ant, but you'll blow up your apartment. Okay? Make it proportional. There are things you can do without option pricing, and if you can do them without option pricing, why bring out Black-Scholes other than to show off, hey look, I have an MBA, I've got Black. It's an intimidation factor. And the reason I say that is there are a lot of things that you can do with plain statistics and decision trees that accomplish almost everything you want to do with an option pricing model. You know how decision trees work, right? You sit down, and this is particularly useful if you have risks that are discrete risks, like regulatory risk, approval risk, and you draw the branches. And with decision trees, you're not restricted to 2 branches. You can have 3 branches, 5 branches, 8 branches. You attach probabilities and cash flows, and you come up with an expected value. I'll tell you, this is a place where you probably will find this most useful, is especially when you're looking at young drug companies with drugs working their way through the pipeline. Let me take a hypothetical. Let's suppose you have a company that has a single product. It's a pre-revenue company. It has a single drug working its way through the pipeline, and it's a drug to treat diabetes. They're on the verge of doing a big test. They don't know what the test will deliver, but the future lies ahead of them. If the test goes well and it succeeds, then they're going to, from this test, they can tell whether it's working on just type 1 or just type 2 or type 1 and type 2 or doesn't work at all. And once they've found out which type, then they have a follow-up test that they have to do. So at each stage there are these, so when you draw decision trees, you will find 2 types of nodes. The round nodes are chance nodes that are determined by fate. The triangular nodes are decision nodes. Basically, you get to decide what to do. So the first stage If you get a bad result on the test, you basically decide to abandon. So, so essentially at each stage what you do is you draw out the probabilities and the cash flows, and you decide up front, depending on where you end up in the branches, whether you will continue or stop. Let's cut to the chase. We get to the very end and you work it out. This drug can have values anywhere from 887 million if it succeeds at every stage. It's good for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. To minus 328 million if it fails at a really late stage. You see why failing early is better than failing late? If you fail early, you stop, right? 50 million. But if you keep going through thinking you're going to succeed, and after you've sunk all the money you fail, if I take because remember I have probabilities, I can just take the expected value. It's called rolling back a tree. It sounds fancy, but I just take the expected values and roll back. The value that I get for the drug today, based on my expectations for the future, is about $50 million. I could have got the same value with an option pricing model, but I don't need it. If I can draw a decision tree, I'm going to use it before an option pricing model. And often when people say, can I use an option pricing model, one of the things you might want to stop and ask is, can I get away just using decision trees here and get to roughly the same answer? Because you don't need to draw on all the technology and the baggage that comes with option pricing models. So here are the three key tests for options. So next time somebody says the word real options, first make sure that there is an option that you should even be talking about. There should be an underlying asset and a contingent cash flow. Those are the two requirements for an option. Is it there? Second, does that option have significant economic value? Don't forget the word. Is it exclusive? Is there exclusivity? And third, to decide whether you can use an option pricing model to attach a price to the option, ask yourself, can I create a replicating portfolio? What does that require? That the underlying asset be traded and you can borrow and lend. And can I do arbitrage? Because without replication arbitrage, I can give you an option pricing number, but you can't monetize it, just a number. Right? So let's talk about real options in practice. I'm going to take you back to corporate finance. Remember when you do a net present value of a project, you take the expected cash flows, you discount them back, you come up with an NPV. We know the rule. The NPV is less than 0, it's a bad project. NPV is positive, it's a good project. Don't abandon that rule. It's a great starting rule, but it's not the end of the game. And here's why. That analysis is a static analysis. Given where we are now, what we know today, that is what the project looks like. But as I said, you can have a bad project, but the rights to that project can still be valuable, because if you delay the project and defer it, it could become a good project. Why? Because the world can shift under you. That's the first. We're going to talk about the option to delay. The second is you could have a bad project, and you might still choose to take the bad project because it gives you a chance to enter a new market, a much bigger market, things that you think will be worth a lot. It's called the option to expand. And that's actually the most exciting option. People talk about the values of platforms. It's big now in Silicon Valley. I don't make any money, but I have a platform. Right? Everybody from Bird to Uber claims to have a platform. The platform, of course, is they've created this way of users coming together. And they're making an options argument, which is, we don't know what we're going to do with this yet, but look, we have a platform. The option to expand is essentially what they're talking about. We'll talk about a way in which you can separate valuable options to expand from not so valuable options to expand. And thirdly, I want to talk about the option to abandon. It's always nice to be able to walk away from your mistakes, both in business and in personal life. Right? So that job offer you get, it's nice if you have some flexibility to walk away from your mistakes. We'll talk about the option to abandon, how it can add value to a company. So essentially with all of these, what we're talking about are things that are going to let us take what would have been a bad investment in capital budgeting and essentially take it anywhere. And this is why it's so dangerous. I'm letting you play the strategic game, right? You talk about using buzzwords, but this time I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. I'm going to make strategic into something that is tangible. Real options and strategic are just two words for the same thing. And I'm going to talk about how do you put a number on it. So let's start with the option to delay. So let's start at the basics. When I take the present value of the cash flows, discount them back, come up with the present value today, I have a net present value as of today. But if I give you the rights to this project, you get the right to take this project at any point in time. It's a call option. Let me back that up. Remember I said that one of the easiest ways to detect whether there's an option is to draw the payoff diagram. So I'm going to be pretty religious about drawing the payoff diagram with every option that I introduce. So when I want to talk about the option to delay, here's what the payoff diagram looks like. You've given me the rights to take this project. I can do it at any time by taking the initial investment. That becomes the equivalent of my strike price. I will do it only if the present value of the cash flows exceed that right. So that becomes the underlying asset, the project cash flows. Is it possible that I could buy the rights to a bad project and it could stay bad for the rest of the period? Yeah, in which case, what do I lose? Whatever I paid to get the rights to this project. I'm going to use this option to delay as the basis to talk about two real options we run into in practice. And some of you will have companies where you do. The first is if you have a company that owns a patent, a license, the right to do something. It's not viable today, but it could be valuable because you have the right to do it any time over the next 15 years. So let's make this real. Let's suppose you own a patent in a country where patents are actually enforced, so you have to be careful about adding that qualifier. So you and only you can develop this patent into a commercial product. But you have the right? Not an obligation. You don't have to develop it. Let's assume that the value of the cash flows you will get if you develop the patent is V, and the cost of developing the patent is I. So very simple. If V is greater than I, you will develop the patent and keep the difference. If V is less than I, what will you do? Sit and wait and hope that something good happens, and something good happens. And if nothing good happens, at the end of the period, you just throw away your option. So let's draw that as a payoff diagram. The cost of converting the patent into a commercial product becomes the equivalent of the strike price. The value of the cash flows you will get by developing the patent becomes the equivalent of the S, the stock price in the model. If the value of the cash flows exceeds the cost, you will develop the patent and make the difference. If that doesn't happen, what's the end game? You will lose whatever you spent to get the patent. What are the two ways companies get patents? One is buying them. That's easy. The other is developing it themselves. And what do you spend to develop a patent? What's the cost of getting a patent? R&D. R&D expenses are just the price you pay to buy an option. Already you can see the implications, right? If you're a company and you want to direct R&D and you think of it in terms of options, where should your R&D go? Where there's the most uncertainty. That's where the value of the options will be greatest. There's your call option. And if you can somehow get the inputs to this model, you can value a patent or a license using this. So let me at least set it up, and then we'll talk about how we'd estimate it. If I wanted to value a patent as an option, here are the inputs I need. First, I need a value for the cash flows if I develop the patent today. So this is like a capital budgeting. If you develop the patent today, you've got to estimate what the cash flows will be for the next 14, 15, 16 years. Take the present value. It will look just like a traditional project. And while you're doing this, you're going to keep complaining. You know why? You say, it's a patent. I don't know what the market looks like. I'm very uncertain. To which my response is, that's good. Why is that good? Because if you felt certain about the cash flows, what happens to the value of the option? There's none. It's because you're uncertain that we're doing this. So make your best judgments, come up with the present value, that becomes the S in the model. Then I ask you, what's the variance in that value? You try to run to Bloomberg to look it up, and it'll say, I'll save you the trouble. This is a patent. Bloomberg is not going to tell you that. So this you got to come up with by yourself. And there are two ways you can do it. One is, remember we did those Monte Carlo simulations? When you do the present value of a project, could you do it as a simulation? You can make the distributions for the inputs, come up with the... And when you do a simulation, you will get a present value, but you'll also get a standard deviation in that present value. That can then become the variance you use. So that's one way, is to do simulation. The other is to cheat. Look, say I'm a biotech company. I know what the standard deviation of biotech company stock prices are. Stock prices are variable because the underlying cash. So it's a leap of faith, but it's easy to get. You take the standard deviation from publicly traded stocks and use them as your option variance. So I've got the value of the underlying asset. I've got the variance. The exercise price here is the cost of making the investment you need to develop the patent into a product. What will that depend on? Whatever you need to do to actually make this patent into a product. It might mean building production facilities, a sales team, whatever you need to do, that becomes that upfront cost. The option lasts as long as the patent lasts. So if you have 12 years left in the patent, your option life is the remaining life of the patent. It's not what the project life is, it's what the remaining life of the patent is. And now I'm going to introduce a cost of not exercising the patent once it becomes viable. And I'll tell you why I need to do this. If I don't introduce a cost to waiting, you know how long you'll wait. What do we do with traditional options once an option gets in the money? We never exercise early. The time premium means we'll always keep the option live. So in a traditional option, I will hold and hold and hold till the very last second of the very last day. I don't want you to do that with a patent because you'll run out of all that useful life. So I'm going to introduce a cost, and here's what the cost is. Let's say you have 15 years left on your patent, and the patent is now viable. Part of you wants to develop, it's now a viable patent, but the other part of you says, let's wait, we can learn more about the drug or the patent. Well, let's look at the trade-off. If you wait, you will collect more information, but by waiting, what have you lost? So you have 15 years left of the patent, you decide to wait a year, you've lost 1 out of the 15 years of protection from competition. So every year you wait, I'm going to introduce that cost. And as you get closer and closer to patent expiration, the cost will actually rise from 115 to 114 to 113. And there'll be a tipping point where the option will get worth less than actually exercising the option. You're going to exercise the option. So let's see if we can actually come up with the inputs we need to value something real out there. In the abstract, we can set up these examples ad nauseum and plug in numbers hypothetically. So I'm going to go back about 20 years. About 20 years ago, a company called Biogen, it's still around, it's one of the larger biotechnology companies. At that time, it was a small biotech company, had come up with a drug called Avonex. Avonex is a drug to treat MS. Okay? It's a big blockbuster drug that had come out. Biogen had actually never fully developed a drug before. They developed drugs, but they'd also always license them out because the production is so expensive, they didn't want to deal with that. But this drug, they wanted to do it themselves. So let's help Biogen figure out how much Avonex is worth to them. To value Biogen, first I'm going to value it using a traditional discounted cash flow valuation. What does that require me to do? If I develop the drug today, what will the value of the drug be? Have you ever seen how drug companies estimate cash flows in a drug? It's a little morbid and actually kind of scary. Because here's how it'll start. It'll start off with the number of people who are estimated to have MS in the entire population. Then it'll look at the percentage of that group that will actually go to a doctor, and it's not 100%. Then it'll look at the percent of the people who go to a doctor who actually get the right diagnosis, and it's not 100%. And among the people who get the right diagnosis, you'll get the percent of people who actually get the right drug attached, not 100%. And then among the people who are given the drug, look at the percent of people who will actually take the drug, and it's not 100%. So what you'll have is you'll start off with, let's say, 3 million people with MS, and by the time you're done pruning it down, maybe you'll have 350,000 people taking your drug. And you project out the pricing, the revenues, the rest looks pretty much like any other. So they've actually done this. The reason I've stuck with Avonex is I actually got my hands on the original cash flow analysis Biogen did on Avonex. And the present value of the cash flows they got by discounting the cash flows from developing the drug immediately was $3,422 million. So if you develop the drug right away, the present value of the cash flows is $3,422 million. The cost of actually developing the drug to Biogen was huge because they'd never developed a drug before. So they'd have to build the infrastructure, the sales teams, and the cost was $2,875 million. If I paused right there and asked you what the net present value for this project was, what's the net present value for the project? It's going to be 3,422 minus 2,875, which is 547 million. So if this were a traditional valuation, we're done, right? This is the value of the drug, let's move on. But here's what makes this interesting. They haven't developed the drug yet. They have 17 years of protection left. The future is uncertain. Lots of things can change. So I put in that through a variance of 0.224, which looks at the variance of publicly traded biotechnology companies. Is the drug already viable? Yeah. It's already in the money. And if you choose not to develop it, which is your choice, what do you lose? You lose one out of your 17 years of protection, which acts as my cost. That acts like a dividend yield. And that's why I made a big deal about the Black-Scholes dividend. Because the reason it's like a dividend, every time dividends get paid, the underlying asset value drops. Every time you wait, your underlying asset value drops. I plug the numbers and I get D1 and D2, so that's from the Black-Scholes, N of D1 and N of D2. The value that I get for Avonex valued as an option is $907 million. What is the net present value? 547 million. Where's the extra 360 million? This is always a mystery in options. Where is that 360 million additional value coming from? And there it gets tricky, right? Because especially with drugs, you're saying, what am I finding out by waiting? You're finding out about side effects. You're finding out about potential other diseases you could treat with it. That extra 360 million comes from the optionality. Now do you see why people are fascinated? They love real options. I've added 360 million to a DCF value. But here's the bad news if you have MS. The value of the drug developed is 547 million. The value of the drug undeveloped as an option is 907 million. If Biogen is playing by the numbers, what should they do? They should wait. In fact, I worked out how long they'd have to wait. And it turns out each year that they wait, the cost of delay goes up. There will be a tipping point, but it's not going to happen till almost year 8. So you'll have to wait 8 years, even though the drug is out there, it's viable. With MS, you're sitting there, when is it coming out? When is it coming out? When is it coming out? And why are they waiting? Because the benefits of waiting exceed the costs. And let me complete the story and then I'll open up for questions. They actually developed almost within 2 years of the drug becoming viable. What do you think tipped the scales for them? Why is the cost, what did I describe as the cost of waiting? 1 out of 7. Do they actually have 17 years of full protection? They have 17 years of protection on this version of the drug to treat MS, right? What I forgot to tell you was that Merck and Pfizer were working on their own drugs to treat MS, and those drugs were about 5 to 6 years away from coming to the market. So what should my true cost of delay be? I don't get 1 out of 17 years, I get 1 out of 6 years, because 6 years from now there's going to be another drug in the market. And if I put a cost of delay of 1/6 in there instead of 1/17, it very quickly makes the option value disappear. So here's the bottom line. If you're in a competitive pharmaceutical market, the optionality in drugs very quickly dissipates because you can't afford to wait. If you're a monopoly pharmaceutical company, you are going to wait because you want to find out as much as you want to dot every I, you're going to cross every T, you're going to wait 11 years, 9 years, 10 years. It's actually an argument for why you need competition in the drug development business, because otherwise you're going to have companies waiting and waiting and waiting until they feel that the cost of waiting exceeds the cost of just developing right away. Question? Go ahead.
So just curious, how do you make that next graph? Is that by...
So basically what I do is I hold everything else constant. I compute the present value cash flows of it. So basically I do the whole option pricing models, rolling the window to 16 years left of cash flows, 116. So I update all the inputs. In 15 years I update all the... Here's what changes though. Present value will decrease every year because I'll have fewer years of cash flows, but the cost of delay rises every year because I have fewer years left to expiration. You combine those two forces, there's going to be a tipping point. Right? And that tipping point is when the value of the option actually drops below the exercise value. And that happens in year 9. It'll be 1/6 next year, 1/16. The year after will be 1/5. So it's actually very simple. So it'll actually keep rising as I go from 1/15, 1/4, and by the time I get to 10 years left, cost of delay will be 10%. Yep.
So the present value of doing like the cash flows right now, would
Yep.
that be meaning that today they've already completed phase 3 and they can go into...
If there's a earlier phase, it's not going to be captured in the option pricing model. That's got to be a probability. So there's let's say they're still in phase 3 and there's an 80% chance they'll make it through phase 3, you'll multiply the option value by 80%. So the option value is once you got there, you have the right to develop it, the clock starts running on it as an option. So let's say I decide to use this approach to value a firm with patents. There are 2 ways I can value a firm with very valuable patents. One is the old-fashioned DCF way, where I tell a story. This company has great patents. In my story, how is that going to play out? Great patents translate into high growth, high returns on capital. So I could give you a story with traditional DCF. And for 90% of companies, I'll be quite honest, that's what I'm going to do. But if you have a small company that gets a big portion of its value from a single patent, then there's another way I can do this. I can actually divide the company into 3 slices. The first is the patent, which I can value as an option like I did for Avenex. The second is any existing drugs they have that are already commercially developed, which I can value with a DCF model. They already have cash flows. And the third is they have an ongoing R&D department. I have to decide whether that ongoing R&D department is going to create value, do nothing for value, or destroy value. Do you see what I have to do there? Look at what you're spending on R&D, what you get back. So I'm going to try this on Biogen, and it's going to be messy. I'll admit up front, I have to make some judgment calls along the way. Let me start with the easy part first. At the time that I valued Biogen, it had 2 drugs that had already developed that it had licensed out to, I think, Pfizer for the next 12 years, and it was receiving a fixed license fee. There are 2 ways you can license a drug. One is you can take a fixed license fee, where the license fee is guaranteed upfront by the licensor, or you can take a % of revenues. And I'm going to ask you what my discount rate would be under both scenarios. Here was a fixed license fee, $50 million a year for the next 12 years. I want to calculate the value, $50 million a year for the next 12 years, a present value. So I need a discount rate, right? So what do you think I used as my discount rate? This is a cash flow guaranteed by Pfizer. It's not quite risk-free. Why? What's the chance I will not get it? If Pfizer goes bankrupt or defaults, I'm going to be in trouble. So the discount rate I used was I used a pre-tax cost of debt for Pfizer. I could use a CDS, but I don't have that. If I know the rating for Pfizer, and I could tell you its pre-tax cost of debt is 7. So let me ask you some what-if questions. What if I had licensed this to the U.S. government? What would I use as my discount rate? I'd use as a risk-free rate. What if this were a percentage of my of revenues? Instead of getting a fixed fee, I said, give me a % of revenues. Then what would I use as my discount rate? Come on, you can reason it through. So what's the risk here? It comes from operations. What's the discount rate that goes with the discount rate in operations? It's not equity, revenues, right? It will be a cost to capital of pharmaceutical companies. What if it's a percentage of net income? That's cost of equity. You guys have it figured out. What I'm saying is don't use cost of capital as a discount rate in every scenario. Be flexible. The cash flow you're discounting can range anywhere from risk-free to highly risky. So how a license is constructed can make a big difference in what you use as your discount rate. So that's the first slice, the value of existing growth. They have an ongoing R&D department. This is going to be a headache to deal with. They're spending a lot in R&D. That's a given. In fact, they're pretty open about their plans. At the time that I valued them, they want to increase their R&D spending by about 20% a year. 100 million growing at 20% a year, I can estimate what you're going to spend on R&D. Will that R&D create value, destroy value, or do nothing for value? What does it depend on? What kind of return and success rate turning out is return on capital. If you think in return on capital terms, am I going to make more than my cost of capital, less than my... If I tell you, the easiest scenario for you is, if I tell you this R&D is just creating a return on capital roughly equal to its cost of capital, what's the value of this slice? It's going to be 0. If I tell you it earns a return on capital 2% above the cost of capital, then it's going to create value if it earns 2% less. So here's what I did for the second slice for Biogen. I looked at what the return on capital was for biotechnology companies collectively. It was about 4% higher than the cost of capital. And if you capitalize that, it turns out that $1 invested in R&D creates about $1.25 in additional value. So what I did was I took the R&D cost, which they gave me, I multiplied by 1.25, 25% additional value. The difference between those two numbers is the value created. I discounted that value at a much higher discount rate because this is a very uncertain part of my valuation. I'm not sure the R&D will pay off. And what I get as a present value is $318.3 million. Let me ask a few what-if questions. If I told you that $1 in R&D creates $1 in value, what will happen to this table? All these numbers will become 0. The value will go to 0. If I tell you the $1 invested in R&D creates 80 cents in value, then you're going to see that adding R&D actually makes the company less valuable. So the R&D is now being dealt with in terms of future drugs, and I'm looking at the net effect on value. I've got all 3 slices done. The value of Biogen put together is $397 million for their existing licenses, $907 million for the Avenex option, $318 million for the R&D as a continuing business. You add the 3 numbers up, you come up with $1.622 billion. Remember when you discount free cash flows, the cost of capital, you come up with the value of the operating assets. This is the analogous number. So if I were doing a valuation of Biogen, this would become the value of my operating assets. I would add cash, I'd subtract out debt, subtract out equity options. Everything else still has to be done. But it's a different way of arriving at the value of the operating assets. Now do you see why I would never do this for a Pfizer? If I tried to do this for a Pfizer, what would I have to do? Take each patent that they have valued as an option, which would be what? Hundreds and hundreds of patents. And you have a portfolio of patents and you have a large amount of existing drugs, it becomes pointless even doing this because the added value that you're getting from doing it drops off. This is really a technology used when you have a small pharmaceutical company with a single or maybe two patents that you think are driving the value of the company. And there is some value added then if you think of it as an option. So let's pass patents through the option test. You ready? Is there an option here? Now what am I looking for? Is there an underlying asset? Yes, the underlying asset is the drug that comes out of the patent. The contingency is the present value of the cash flows exceed the cost of developing your development. So clearly there's an option. Is there exclusivity? Yeah, it comes from what? It comes from legal enforcement of the patent. Remember, the patent itself is not what gives you exclusivity. It's somebody standing behind the patent. So if you're in a system where I give you patents but then I don't protect you, it's meaningless. Or I say go to court and it takes you 27 years in court to actually get your money back, it's meaningless. Just because you have a legal system doesn't mean you get justice if you have to wait 30 or 35 years. Patents have value only if they're enforced. In this case, that's what's giving you the exclusivity. Can I use an option pricing model to value a patent? I just did, right? But you see the dangers in what I did? The underlying asset is not traded. The option is not traded. I can't buy and sell patents. This is perhaps the most dangerous use of option pricing model. The value I got of 907 million, there's no way I can monetize that value. So if somebody offered me 600 million for the drug, I'll probably take it. I can't sit there saying, well, I came up with the value of 907 million, I'm not selling it to you, because it's not easy to monetize that number. It's not a tradable option. It's not replicable. Any questions? So now you can see why having a license, a patent, an exclusive right gives you this added value, because you get the right to do something. Let's move on to a second application of the option to delay. Say you have an oil company. Okay? When you look at an oil company, some of the value comes from the fact that they have developed reserves from which they extract the oil and they sell the oil, they get cash flows, traditional discounted cash flow valuation. Some of the value comes from the fact that they have undeveloped reserves, reserves that they can choose to develop if they want to. You see what the optionality is there? You can choose to develop the reserves. Let's frame the choice. If the cost of development is X and the value of the oil under the ground is V, if V is greater than X, then developing will create a cash flow. But if V is less than X, you're going to sit and wait for what? For oil prices to go up. The optionality here comes from the fact that the commodity price can change over time. So if I were drawing this as a payoff diagram, the cost of developing the reserve becomes the equivalent of the strike price. The value of the oil under the ground becomes the equivalent of the stock price. And the value of the oil exceeds the cost. I develop the reserve and make the difference. Is it possible that might never happen? There are oil companies now with reserves that they acquired 4 or 5 years ago that will cost $70 or $80 a barrel to develop. That might never be viable. In which case, what have you lost? Whatever you spent to get those reserves, which might be either exploration costs or the fact that you acquired them in an auction. So a cost of delay. So let's try this again in terms of how we get the inputs. To value the oil under the ground, what do I need? First, I need a geologist who taps rocks and says, I have never figured out how they actually do this, but they seem to have a better track record than equity research analysts, so let's take them for what they're worth. So basically you need somebody to say there are 1 billion barrels of oil under the ground. And then you multiply by an expected oil price, you come up with the value of oil in the ground. So that becomes the value of the oil, that becomes the present value that you use. The cost of developing the reserve depends on where the reserve is. If it's in Saudi Arabia, you stick your finger in the sand, the oil comes out. You're in Canada, you got to go 5,000 feet under the ground, get under snow, pull the snow out, then tap the shale, go another 1,000 feet, maybe the oil will come out. So in some parts of the world, I think the estimate for Aramco is it costs them $4 a barrel to extract the oil. In contrast, in Canada, it could be $55 depending on where it is. So depending on which part of the world you're in, the cost of developing reserves depends on what kind of reserves it is and what's the life of this option. Most times when you have reserves, you don't get them in perpetuity. You usually bid for them in auction. And when you bid for them in auction, you're given the rights to develop the reserve for the next 15, 20, 25 years. That becomes the life of the option. This is an easier option value because what causes the value of the underlying asset to vary? It's the price of the commodity. The amount of oil might change because your geologist goes crazy, he's manic depressed, so today he says 100. But usually it's the price of the oil that changes. So every time the oil price changes, the value of oil under the ground also changes. So here when you ask me what the variance is, I can actually look at something that is traded, oil, gold, iron ore. That becomes the variance you use. And one of the things you will notice is, anytime you use an option pricing model, the variance you're supposed to use is the variance in the log of the price. Not the variance in the price itself or the variance in returns. You know why we use the variance in the log of the price? What's the distribution the Black-Scholes is built on? Normal distribution. If I do variance in the problem with prices is prices cannot be less than 0. The log of 0 is minus infinity. I'm giving myself a shot. It's not guaranteed that at least there's a chance that the log of the price could be normally distributed. That's why you'll see people using variance in the log of the price. But you know what? If you're in a hurry, use variance in returns. Not a big deal. So I'm using variance in the log. Here again, I'm going to introduce a cost of delay. You see why? Because if you have reserves for the next 20 years and they become viable and they keep waiting and wait, it's not like in the last day you can take all the oil out of the ground in one day. You better develop the reserve once it becomes viable. So if you wait, what I'm going to charge you with is what you could have got as cash flows by developing the reserves. That's what you're giving up by waiting. And again, I'm doing this because I want you to exercise once it becomes viable. And finally, when you think about exercising this option, let's say you buy a call option on a stock, Uber, once it goes trade. How long does it take you to exercise? You go on your brokerage account, you hit the button, you've exercised, right? Let's say oil prices go to $100 a barrel. And somebody, head honcho in ExxonMobil, decides to exercise. He picks up the phone, if he's still using a phone, say, exercise. What exactly happens the next day? Absolutely nothing, right? Because what has to happen? Engineers have to jump on planes, go to the oil fields, put up rigs, and if you're lucky, what might happen? 2 years from now, oil comes out of the ground. You see the risk you're exposed to when you exercise this real option as opposed. What could happen over those 2 years? Why did you pick up the phone? Oil prices jump to $100 a barrel. 2 years from now, the oil starts to come out of the ground. Oil prices could be back down to $30 a barrel. There's a development lag, which essentially means, A, there's first a waiting period to actually get the cash flows. And second, unless you protect yourself using futures and options, you run this risk of the price changing under you. So let's think about how we would get these inputs. And I'm going to use an example from, again, way back in time. And I'm going to explain why I couldn't just use an oil company from today. A company called Gulf Oil was targeted in a hostile acquisition in the early 1980s. And one of the reasons it got targeted was because it had huge undeveloped oil reserves. It had 3,038 million barrels of oil in its undeveloped reserves. At that time, the estimated cost of developing all these reserves was on average $10 a barrel. So if I pause right there, if they were willing to pay $30.38 billion, they could develop all the reserves. They would never do that. Why? Because if you developed all 3,038 million barrels, if you brought them to the market at the same time, even if you could, you'd cause the price to be affected. But let's do a hypothetical. They could develop the reserves. We know what it will cost them. The average life of the reserves was about 12 years. Lots of reserves in different places. The price of oil was about $22.38 a barrel at that time. The variable cost is 7. So every barrel of oil they get out of the ground, they're making about $15.38 a barrel. The T-bond rate was 9%. And I'm not kidding. It was really 9%. We were in a different age in terms of risk-free rates. And Gulf, once it developed these reserves, can expect to get cash flows, which are roughly 5% of the value of the reserve. So if it becomes viable and they choose not to develop it, that's what they're leaving behind because they chose to wait. So let's see what the value of these undeveloped reserves is. If I take the value of the oil under the ground, 3,038 million barrels times $15.38, that's the profits I make. But remember, I don't get cash flows for the first 2 years. This looks a lot like discounting, but what I'm doing is I'm not counting the first 2 years of cash flows because I have to wait 2 years. There's a development lag. The value that I get for the oil under the ground. So if I choose to pull the trigger today to develop all the reserves, the value of the oil under the ground is about $42.38 billion. The cost of developing the reserves today, if I look at the existing cost, is about $30.38 billion. So let me pause right there. If I did a DCF valuation of these undeveloped reserves, the DCF value will be 42.38 minus 30.3, which is about $12 billion. File that away. That's my DCF value for the reserves. But remember, I've not developed the reserves yet. I have 12 years left. There's a variance in oil prices of about 0.03. The riskless rate is 9%, and I give up 5% for every year that I wait. I plug the numbers in, and I get N of D1 and N of D2. Remember what N of D2 told me? Roughly speaking, it's a probability that I will exercise this option. There's a very high chance I'm going to develop these reserves. It's not surprising. They're in the money. But the value that I get for the option is 13.3 billion. What is the DCF value? 12 billion. Where's the extra 1.3 billion coming from? Time is one, but you need one other thing for the option value to kick in. Time is only a piece. Their oil price of variance. In fact, if I made oil prices completely fixed, what will happen to the value of the option? They'll go to zero. The more volatile oil prices get, the larger that premium is going to be. Do you see the implication of this? If you're an oil company with developed and underdeveloped reserves, the level of oil prices affects you, but so does the variance. Because that variance can make your undeveloped reserves more or less valuable because they're options. Yes?
What happens if the time frame is unlimited? So you're working with a state-owned oil company that already owns all the reserves.
In perpetuity, it doesn't matter. You still have a cost of delay, right? You're giving up cash flows, no matter how many years you have left. Because if Aramco chooses not to take the oil out of the ground now, because they think oil price will be higher in the future, that's their prerogative. But they give up cash flows they could have got. They have the capacity to get more oil under the ground. So there is always a cost to delay. And it's no longer a function of the remaining life. It's basically a function of what you can get as cash flows by developing today.
So how would you represent it mathematically? How would it, because I see that there's a T obviously.
The T basically just is going to be if you take the number of barrels of oil you have in your reserves and your capacity to get oil out, even if you have the reserves in perpetuity, you can think about how many years it will take you to get all the oil out. You can make that the T in the option pricing model. You can't value options. In fact, options which are perpetual, the value converges on the value of the oil under the ground. Basically the optionality goes away. Okay? So 13.3 billion, the extra premium comes from the fact that oil prices are uncertain. So if I were to complete this valuation, here's what I did. I took the existing, just like I did for Biogen, I took the existing reserves and valued them using a DCF model. So I took the cash flows, discounted back at the cost of capital. Value that I got was about 5.065 billion for the developed reserves. To that, I added the 13.3 billion, valued as an option. The sum of those two becomes the value of my firm, subtract our debt and divide by the number of shares. The value per share that I got was $51.25. What triggered this particular valuation was an acquisition bid at 70, backed up by this view. Anadarko, which right now is being targeted by both Chevron. I think this morning Occidental entered. I thought it was accidental first, but then it's Occidental. I thought somebody made an accidental bid for $39 billion. So that makes sense. The bank is really going crazy here, accident. But it's Occidental and Chevron, both bidding for Anadarko. If you get a chance, take a look at Anadarko. See what's driving that, because they do have a fair amount of undeveloped reserves. And this might be a Gulf oil kind of analysis where you're paying for those reserves. Those reserves can be non-viable. But to the extent that, same thing can be said about Petrobras. A lot of reserves for Petrobras are not viable today, but those non-viable reserves are options, and those options have value. Yes?
What about incorporating the option value of searching for reserves?
Don't, be careful, there is no, what is the option? What's the exclusivity in searching? Anybody can search, you can search, I can search. So the fact that you can search and I can search, there is no option value. That's why that exclusivity is such a useful word to bring in, is unless that searching is exclusive. Okay? Maybe it's again a government protection. Nobody else can search for oil in this part of the world except for whatever the company is. There's no optionality. Yeah. Yes?
So do you think searching for oil is considered R&D or an expense?
It is part of looking for an option. Right? Because remember, exploration costs include searching, it includes hiring the geologist, doing whatever you need to do. All of that is part. So you're buying options. That's what I think of as all these costs are the price you're paying to acquire options. Some of those options are going to be viable, some are not going to be viable, but it's all part of that cost. So let's talk about the option to expand. Incidentally, on the natural resource option, let's pass it through the test. Okay? Is there an option? Underlying asset is the oil, contingent cash flows, the value. So, okay. Is there exclusivity?
Yes.
Where does the exclusivity come from?
Rights to business.
There's only so much oil under the ground, right? That's where the exclusivity comes from. And you know what? That's actually a very interesting proposition, because I'm going to argue that real estate in Kansas City has no optionality, but real estate in Manhattan has an optionality. And here's why. In Kansas City, you want to build, it's flat. You're in the middle of the country. You've got land going out hundreds of miles. You just keep building. Manhattan is an island, and it's a heavily zoned island, which means every square inch of Manhattan is already spoken for. You know that every square inch of Manhattan, the square footage that can be built is already preset. Okay? It's a story that people don't know. When we built this business school, because we were downtown for the graduate school, used to be downtown, and they built this in '92. The cost was, of course, inflated because it's New York. Okay? But the original architect's plans had 14 floors on this building. As you well know, if you've taken the elevator on the business school, there are only 11. You say, what happened to the top 3? So I remember this, it took 6 months. We paid the architect $3 million. He builds 14 floors. And then about 3 months later, he says, oops, we have a problem. So what's the problem? Remember there used to be a gym called Coles down the street that they're now knocking down and building some behemoth? You probably, the NYU gym used to be down there. And it turned out that when they built that gym, they borrowed square space from above this part, because they never thought they were going to build over Gold Plaza. So they said, no, we're not going to, I don't even know how this works, that you borrow space that doesn't even exist. And they used it to build Cold Center. So when they went for this building they said, you can't build those top 3 floors. You're going above what's allowed in this space. We actually had to, they couldn't lop off. We were saying, why don't you just lop off the top 3 floors? That's not the way architecture works, right? So they actually had to go back and start from scratch. It cost us another 6 months in building time and a huge amount in cost. But if you're able to, let's say you buy, you know what this means, right? If you buy a 2-story building in Manhattan on an area of land where you can build a 50-story building, you're not paying price per square foot for what's there. You're paying for the option to build, even though today nobody will buy. Let's say you're in a terrible real estate market. You're saying, hey, today I wouldn't build it doesn't matter if today you won't build it. Sometime you might want to, which means you're always paying for the optionality to develop real estate, which means every piece of property in Manhattan has an option embedded in it. It's an interesting thought when you think about natural resources and limits put in by nature. So there is obviously an option, there is exclusive. Can I use an option pricing model here? This is one of the few real options where I have a chance of trading the underlying asset, right? What's the underlying asset? The oil under the ground. I can trade oil. So this is the closest you get to being able to get all the conditions met, which is one reason real options have their deepest roots in natural resource companies. They've been used for 25 years here. People use them. They're comfortable with them because they actually do work. One final point and then we'll end for the day. The option to expand. What does it mean? Well, you take a project. An option to expand actually is 2 projects. The first project is a negative net present value project. Nobody's even debating about it. The first project is a bad project. But by taking the first project, you get the right to do a second project. And that second project is what tips the scale here. So let's see how this would be played out in terms of options. That additional investment you have to make to expand becomes equivalent. But because the first project, there's no optionality. You're going to take the project, negative net present value, you accept it. But by taking the project, you get the right to expand, the right. The cost of expansion becomes the strike price. The present value of the cash flows from expanding become the value, the underlying asset. And if the present value never exceeds it, then what do you give up? What's the cost? What did I describe the first project as being? A negative net present value project. You say, I wish I hadn't done that. The option to expand comes from taking that second project. And if you remember that Marriott example I gave you last week where you open 10 hotels and then you watch how they do and you get exclusive rights to open another 100 hotels, classic example of the option to expand because the first project had negative net present value. But because it gave you an opening to this much bigger market, you're willing to overlook the first one. And you can argue that when you invest in Uber, if I valued Uber as a present value of the cash flows, it looks terrible. But maybe that option to expand into the autonomous car market is what's keeping you going. So next session, when we start talking about putting numbers on this, we're going to talk about when does that platform have enough value that you're willing to overlook the negative cash flows. Okay. I'll see you on Monday. I just wanted to thank you. Yes.
Curious, so like, how would you value? I know we talked about like way out in the future, but how would you value an asset that, based on replacement cost, could you value an asset based on that? Like for
You don't value it, you just get replacement cost. That's not a value, it's a replacement cost.
like so for instance, like if you had a logistics company and already built out a network, and right now building out a replacement network will cost like let's say 100
Well,
billion.
it's a replacement cost. Why are you calling it value? It's a replacement. I can always find a replacement cost.
Okay.
Whether you want to pay that cost or not depends on what you think you can get as value. So replacement cost is not a way of evaluating, it's just a cost. So
Okay.
this is what it'll cost me to replace it.
Yeah.
But it's neither here nor there because it depends on what that creates as cash flows, right? So it just gives me a number on what the replacement of this building costs. But from a valuation perspective, it's neither here nor there. And from an investing standpoint, I'm not sure it even matters. So what if it costs me $100 billion to replace what you have? What if what you have produces cash flows of $1 billion
Yeah.
each year? I shouldn't be paying $100 billion. The fact that it costs you so much, it's your problem. You probably shouldn't have spent as much as you did to create a business that creates so little in cash flows. So it gives you this false illusion of I can get a replacement cost, therefore I should. That's built on the notion that somebody is out there who you have the right to get your costs back.
Yeah.
Nobody has a right to get anything back, right? So replacement costs are nice to know, but they mean absolutely nothing.
But if we think about in
Yeah.
that sense, right?
Yeah.
Let's say like if you had FedEx or USPS and you had a country where there's only one company that has the scale of FedEx and USPS, but their current value is let's say 30 billion versus like it would cost 70 billion to replace that whole network.
Yeah, but why is it 30 billion? Let's go to why is it 30 billion?
Because the amount you can charge for packaging.
And that's not going to change if I replace your equipment for 70 billion. So basically, you have a bad business. You can't get out of the business. So you're not going to get the 70 billion back. All I'm going to pay you is 30 billion.
So you couldn't make the assumption that eventually like you can
Why?
do liquidation.
Why?
That's true.
Right? If you eventually can raise prices, build into your cash flows, but if you cannot in the 30 billion, presume that you built in the story of what people will pay. You're in a country where people won't pay much for packages. You built this huge network.
Yeah.
You have a problem, but the problem is that you spent too much building a network in a country where people don't want that network. You're not entitled to your money back.
So you have to build a network along with the pricing power.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't pay you for past sunk costs. It's the same argument for book value, right? When people say I should get at least book value for my stock. Why? Well, because that's what I've invested in the company. Hey, that's your problem, not mine, right? You invest in a bad company, I'm not going to give you a book value back. So replacement cost is nice to know, but I'm not sure it tells me anything about value. It tells me about how bad the management of this company has been in the past. And maybe if they had a better management, they can find ways to increase what they can get as cash flows, but that's a value of control. That's got nothing to do with the replacement cost.
Thank you.
Okay.
So for the Black-Scholes model, why do we use the E again to measure present value?
It's based on present value in continuous time, E minus RT. That's the exponent. E is the exponent factor. It's like raising 1 plus R raised to the power T is what we use in discrete time. As you move towards continuous time, it's the exponential. It'll give you roughly, it's a present value factor.
Okay. And on the exam sheet.
There's an E on your calculator.
Oh.
You need to use it. Yeah. Hi.
So for the second part of the project, so we have already done the regression and do we need a report to discuss about that?
There's nothing to discuss. What are you going to discuss about regression? It just tells you what the